Welcome to this year's Purim Shir. The title is A History of Hashgacha. It's a fascinating idea that I'm looking forward to present to you. If you're listening online, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com. I think it will enhance not just our understanding of the Purim story, but it will give a lot of insight and comfort into the times we're living in. I want to focus on the last perek of the Megillah. It's a very short perek, only 3 psukim, and there are two major problems with it. The Perek begins, Vayosem hamelech Hashgacha mas al haaretz ve'iyeh hayom. Hashgacha imposes taxes on his people. Next pasuk, V'chol ma'aseh tokva gvurosoi parshas gedulosoi Mordechai. All the story, the greatness of Mordechai, shegidlo hamelech, that he was appointed and promoted by the king, Hashgacha, halehim ksuvim al sefer divrei hayomim l'malchei modai uparas. They're written in the history books of Persia and Media. And then the Megillah concludes with Pasuk Gimel, Ki Mordechai Yehudi Mishnah LaMelech Hashgacha v'Godla Yehudim Rotzu l'Revecha v'Derish Tov la'Amei v'Dovei Shalom l'Chol Zarei. Now, the first Pasuk Aleph of Perek Yud, the anti-penultimate Pasuk of the Megillah, the third from last Pasuk of the Megillah, is very strange. Why is it relevant that Hashgacha imposes taxes on his people? Why does the Megillah feel it necessary to tell us that? And next question, the next Pasuk, which talks about the Ksuvim, Divrei Hayomev, Malchei Paras and Modai, what is that about? Why are we told that there are chronicles recording the history of these events? Why are these relevant? Has anyone studied them? What is that all about? So, in answer to that second question, Diana Abramsky used to say that Megillas Esther is written for Pirsumin Nisa and to teach us Yiras Shamayim and Hashgacha Pratis, how HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world. The Megillah is telling us in this penultimate pasuk of the Megillah that if you want to study the history books, the actual factual details, let's say, of the Purim story, then you're welcome to do so, but for that you need to go to the history books of Persia and Media. That's not what Megillas Esther is about. Megillas Esther is about Pirsumei Nisa and Hashgacha Pratis, and teaching us Yiras Shamayim. And therefore we see that throughout the whole story of the Megillah, and we need to read the Megillah with that in mind, not as a history book, but as a means to teach Yiras Shamayim and Hashgacha Pratis and Pirsumei Nisa. And that is very much the way the whole Purim story works, and we'll come back to the first question about why the taxes are relevant, because this is very much intertwined with it. There is a vart, and this is the Hakdama to this whole shir, that I've mentioned in the past, but it's so beautiful that I have to mention again, but it's very, very relevant to what we're talking about. The Medrash says in Esther Rabbah, if you look at the first box in paragraph 2, Kol mokum shenema b'Megillah zu lemelech Achashverosh b'melech Achashverosh hakosim medaber. We're talking about Melech Achashverosh. V'chol mokum shenema lemelech stam mashma kodesh v'chol. Then it could refer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it could refer to King Achashverosh. You see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whose name does not appear throughout the whole Megillah, is very much behind the scenes of the whole event. And that is borne out by a vot that Rav Melech Biderman mentions on the very first Mishnah in Maseches Megillah. You open up the first daf of the Gemara in Megillah, the first Mishnah in Megillah says as follows: Megillah nikris be'achadasor, b'shneimosor, b'shleishosor, b'arba'osor, b'chamishosor, le'pachas v'lo yeseh. You can read the Megillah back in the days of Chazal, either on the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, or 15th of Adar, but le'pachas v'lo yeseh, not before and not afterwards, not the 10th and not the 16th. Says Rabbi Melech Biderman an amazing thing. We know that there are two most common names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yud Kei Vav Kei, and the Shem Aleph Daled Nun Yud. Aleph Daled Nun Yud, the Adnus name of Hashem, represents HaKadosh Baruch Hu relating to us through nature, but not through overt miracles. The Yud Kei Vav Kei name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu represents more direct involvement through miracles. Now we know HaKadosh Baruch Hu does both. Pesach is a time of Yud Kei Vav Kei, of more direct and overt miracles, Kriyas Yamsuf, the Makkos, etc., etc. But Purim is an example of Adnus, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu represents and manifests itself through nature, but not through overt miracles. Now here comes the amazing thing. We read the Megillah potentially in the times of Chazal on the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th. If you add up those 5 numbers, 11 plus 12 plus 13 plus 14 plus 15, you get 65, which is the gematria of Aleph and Dalet and Nun and Yud, which is 65. You see the days when you can read the Megillah is Shem Adnus. But lo pachas v'lo yoseh, not 10, not 16. 10 and 16 is 26, which is the gematria of Yud Kei Vav Kei. You can't, Purim is not that. Purim is not Hashem representing through involvement of direct miracles, because that's not what Purim is all about. Purim is about the Shem Adnas, the 65, the 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And you see the Hashgacha in the Purim story throughout, and you see it more throughout history, as we're going to discuss. Here's the first example. Perek Vav Pasuk Dalet. This is the real turning point of the story, where Haman wants to come and tell Achashverosh that he has got a plan for Mordechai. He's building gallows where he wants to hang his arch enemy. At that exact moment, Achashverosh is lying in his bed, he can't sleep, and he's wondering why Esther invited him and Haman to the Suda. Maybe somebody wants to do bad harm against him, but surely somebody would tell me if someone wants to do harm, but maybe someone did me a favor, and they're not telling me about it because I didn't repay them. Is there anybody who did me a favor that I didn't repay? He gets his servants to bring the Divrei Hayomim, the chronicles of his country. And then, at that moment, Haman appears. The pasuk says, "Vayom hamelech mi b'chotzer." Who's out there? For Haman balachotzer beis hamelech. It's Haman who appears just at that moment. Hachitzoyne leimer halamelech litlo says Mordechai lo eitz asher heichin lo. He's coming to tell Achashverosh about this plan that they're going to hang Mordechai. Interestingly, the pasuk says, "Litlos es Mordechai al ha'etz asher heichin lo," to hang Mordechai on the gallows which Haman has prepared for him. So says the Gemara in Megillah Daf Tezayin Amud Aleph, why does it say Asher Heichin Loi? It should just say Asher Heichin. He just prepared. We know it's for Mordechai. It just says that. Literally says Mordechai al Hoi. It's Asher Heichin. That would have been very clear. Says the Gemara in Megillah Tezayin Amud Aleph, Heichin Loi Tana. It was taught Loi Heichin. It was actually prepared for himself. In other words, Haman thought he was preparing these gallows for Mordechai, when in actuality he was preparing it for himself. He literally was erecting the gallows for his own punishment, for his own death. And that is really how HaKadosh Baruch Hu works. That's the ultimate form of Hashgacha, is when HaKadosh Baruch Hu uses our enemies as a vehicle for their own downfall. And you see this in other instances. There's a very beautiful piece in Birchas Peretz, in the Stipler, on which discusses this and others. If you look at the next box, let's go back to Yetzias Mitzrayim, where we see this theme again. In Parsha Shmos, in the very beginning, in Pasuk Chof Beis, the Pasuk says, "Vayitzav paro lechol amoy lemer, kol haben hayilot hayoira tashlichu v'chol habas tachyon." That you've got to destroy all the boys, all the males of the Jewish people. That was Paro's genocide. Says Rashi, lechol amoy, for vayitzav paro lechol amoy, af aleihem gozar, that he decreed not just against Klal Yisrael, but also against his own people. Why? Says Rashi, Yom Shenoilad Moshe, on the day that Moshe Rabbeinu was born, Amrulei Tznignov, his astrologer said to him, Hayom Noilad Moshiach. Today, the leader of the savior of the Jewish people has been born. Ve'enonu Yodim in Mitzrayim, in Misrael. I don't know if he's Egyptian or if he's Jewish. I don't know who this future savior is. But what we do see is that he will eventually be struck by water. Therefore, Gazar Osa Hayom Afal Mitzrayim, and therefore that day Paro decreed against the Mitzrayim as well. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, Kol haben hayiloid, v'lo nema hayolod levrim, that was born to the Hebrews. V'hem lo hayodim shesofer ilkos amei meriva, and of course that astrology, that prophecy, whatever you want to call it, was referring to the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu would have the whole incident of the Mei Meriva, but not referring to anything else. Now, if you look at the next box, in Birchas Peretz, the Stipler says some very interesting observations. Niflois dracheha shel hashgacha elyono. The ways of hashgacha, of divine providence, are wondrous. Kol yesoda shel gezeras ois hayom. All the gezeras of that day, asher boi his achzer ois rasha gam la'amoi shaloi, where that wicked man, Paro, was exceptionally cruel, even to his own people, lo hoy ele metoich pachtoi hagodol b'yasel olam shamashim shel Yisrael. Because of his fear of bringing the leader who was going to save the Jewish people into the world. He was petrified of that. And what actually transpired in the end? The very person who he was trying to kill, by causing all the boys born that day, Hebrews and Egyptians, to be killed, that very person who he was trying to prevent coming into this world actually was raised in his own house under his own nose. b'mo yadav es oisa Mashiach asher osa hakol kedei lahavidim min olam. V'lo zu bilvad. Not only that, oison pa'ulos shebohen nokat kedei lahavidim min olam es Mashiach shel Yisrael hein shahoy ba'ichrov v'hein sheviu legedula shel Moshe b'teich beisai. The decree itself orchestrated the fact that Moshe was going to come into the king's palace. It was only because of the decree of Paro that Yocheved was forced to put Moshe in a basket floating down the Nile. The place where Bisya Bas Paro, Batya, found this basket. So it was a direct result of Paro's own decree that orchestrated the events that Yocheved would put Moshe in a basket, flow down the Nile. Yocheved would find Basya Bas Paro would find her, and ultimately raise her in the palace of Paro under Paro's own nose. Lametcha, to teach us, says the Stipler, ki kol ma'aseh enosh v'tach b'loisov, all the workings of a human being, lo yo'ilu k'dei l'shnos, it's not going to change anything. V'lo b'mashu es asher nigzal min hashamayim. You're not going to avert decrees that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to run in His world. On the contrary, he says, and all the things that a person may want to do to thwart those plans, it will be brought against you regardless. And you see it the same too with Haman as well, as we've just mentioned. The very things that Haman did to strengthen his position were ultimately his downfall. According to the opinion which says Memuchen was Haman, that means Haman himself was the one who advised to get rid of Vashti, and as a result of that, he had to choose a new queen, and he chose Esther. And that was ultimately the catalyst of the downfall of Haman. The example we just said, that morning when the sleep evaded the king Achashverosh, and Haman came to tell him the news that he's prepared a gallows, he wanted to act with alacrity to tell Achashverosh about his plan. But what happened? It gave an opportunity for Achashverosh to say, what wonderful honor can we give to the person who's honored me, who's helped me, and I haven't returned the favor. I haven't thanked him and rewarded him. Thinking that, of course, it was applying to him. And Achashverosh told him to do it to Mordechai. And furthermore, and so too, making of the gallows which Haman had done for Mordechai, that was ultimately the cause for his own hanging. Like Chazal say in the Gemara we just quoted, that he prepared his own gallows for his own death. Haklal concludes the Stipler. Ki kol ma'aseh enosh v'tach b'loisov. All the machinations, all the plots and plans of man. Lo yo'ilu afilu kol shelo hisif aligrea mema shenigzu lo b'rosh Hashanah. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to engineer something, it will happen. Zulas alidei tefillah v'alidei zuchuyos v'tshuvos yochel hagzar din nishtanis. And that's, of course, through a person's genuine tefillah, or through ma'asim tovim, can a person avert a gezeira ra. And sometimes you think you're succeeding. A Rasha may think he's succeeding, he's progressing in his plans. That's because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted it to happen. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted it to sort of evolve in that particular way, but ultimately HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world. What you see from this Stipler is a very powerful idea that is really the theme. The theme is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world. Sometimes you see it directly in the form of Yudke Vovke, and sometimes you see it indirectly, which is really the theme of Purim, the Shem Adnos, the 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, the 65. Now, let me share with you some other examples of this, which are just astonishing. Again, the idea being that behind the scenes, HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world, and not only runs the world where He is puppeteering the sort of how history is going to play out, but he's puppeteering it in such a way that when a Rasha tries to do things, he's actually using the Rasha, the enemy, the arch enemy in the story, to be the vehicle through which to play out the whole Hashgacha. So here's a great example. The pasuk in Ezra says, in Perek Dalet Chaf Dalet, Ba'adin b'teilas avidas beis Elokah. Then the work of the house of God, Yerushalayim, which was in Jerusalem, b'teila, was stopped. V'havas botla achnas tartin lemalchus Daryovesh melech, and it was suspended until the second year of the reign of Daryovesh, of Darius, the king of Persia. Now, says Rashi, who is this fellow? Says Rashi, Acha Achashverosh Malach Daryovesh. After Achashverosh died, his successor was someone called Daryovesh, Benoi Shel Achashverosh, who was the son of Achashverosh, Shehu Ben Esther, was the child of Esther. In other words, amazingly, the Purim story doesn't necessarily have a very happy ending, certainly not for Esther. Whilst we're singing for Esther, it was actually a bit bittersweet, because she was still married to Achashverosh, and they had a child. The child was 100% Jewish. Achashverosh was the father, a non-Jewish father, but the mother was Esther, and therefore Daryovesh was Jewish. He, however, lived a non-Jewish life. He married non-Jewish women, but he was the one who gave permission to rebuild Bayis Sheni, which is amazing. Because, says Rashi over there, Bishnash Taim Daryovesh, and in the second year of his reign, his Chilu Livnos Habinyan Ad Shegamruhu, he was the one who facilitated the building of Bayis Sheni. Now just think about that for a second. We have come full circle. The Megillah starts with celebrating Bayis Sheni not being rebuilt. That's what the Suda was. Achashverosh, the Gemara in Megillah Yud Aleph tells us, calculated, like others before him, that the 70 years after Churban Bayis Rishon had now transpired, and the prophet's fulfillment has not been fulfilled. The prophet said, the Novi said, that after Churban Bayis Rishon, 70 years they're going to be in Golus, then there's going to be Bayis Sheni. And Nebuchadnezzar calculated it, he got it wrong. Achashverosh calculated it, he got it wrong. And therefore, when he calculated the 70 years, he thought, perfect. The fulfillment of the Novi's Nevuah is not coming about. There's not going to be a Bayis Sheni, and that's what they were celebrating the fact that Bayis Sheni was not being rebuilt. That's why they got all the Kelim from the Beis Hamikdash, etc. That very celebration caused the downfall of Vashti. They got drunk. He asked her to come in, as we're familiar with the story, which led to the appointment of Esther, which then ultimately led to the birth of Daryovesh, who was the person who gave Rishus and facilitated building Bayis Sheni. So we've come full circle. Achashverosh, who is celebrating the Beis Hamikdash not being rebuilt, not being the Bayis Sheni, not being built, actually, that Suda was the catalyst for it to be built. Astonishing. In other words, and then another point, an astonishing point, where did Daryovesh get the money from? How did he fund this building of Bayis Sheni? The answer is, we can go back to the pasuk. The pasuk says, "Vayosem hamelech Achashverosh mas al haaretz v'ihei hayam." We've now answered our first question. Do you know why that first pasuk in Perek Yud is so critical? Because when Achashverosh taxed the people and filled his government and kingdom's coffers, he used that money. Daryovesh, Achashverosh's son, used that money to build Bayis Sheni. So it was very critical postscript to the whole story. Let's go further. This is astonishing. This time last year, Rabbi Daniel Gladstein, who I had the pleasure of seeing a few days ago, he was here in London. This time last year, he was also in London, and he spoke in Hasmoni in the base. And he mentioned a very fascinating anecdote. We know who built Torah in America. We're familiar with some of the great Torah pioneers, Shraga Feivel Mendelovitz, Rabbi Aaron Kotler, Moshe Feinstein, all of the giants of the last century. Said Rabbi Gladstein, you know something? It actually goes back much further than that. You know who it was? It was one of the key contributors were some of the arch enemies of the Jewish people, none other than King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Now we're familiar with the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492. Spain at that time was governed by, like I said, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. They expelled the Jews on the 2nd of August 1492, which incidentally happened to be Tisha B'Av. That was the expulsion of Jews from Spain. Now, the very next day, August the 3rd, 1492, is the day that Christopher Columbus set sail to America. What is known today as Christopher Columbus Day, the 12th of October, that's the anniversary of 12th of October 1492, is when he arrived in America. But he actually set sail on the 3rd of August 1492. Now, the day after Jews were expelled. Who funded the trip? It was King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. They wanted to sort of expand their Spanish empire. And therefore, they funded a trip of Christopher Columbus to America. Lakewood, as Rabbi Gladstein put it, should have a plaque. This yeshiva was built by the great benefactors of the Jewish people, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Astonishing. It's the same point. The HaKadosh Baruch Hu uses the enemies of the Jewish people to be the vehicle to operate his Hashgacha and ultimately bring a Yeshua to Klal Yisrael. Here's another example. I'm reading a book at the moment, an astonishing book called, I brought it here, Rabbi Yitzchak Silva. Rabbi Yitzchak Silva is a tzaddik who died about 20 years ago, who, it's hard to describe really, but he lived in Russia in the very difficult times in the first half of the 19th century. He served many difficult years in a Russian labor camp, but maintained his Yiddishkeit throughout and encouraged others and lived a life in very difficult circumstances, and was a victim of Stalin's repressions and anti-Semitic campaigns. And he describes an event that happened when he was in a Russian labor camp in 1953. It was Purim 1953, and I'll read you just a short extract from the book. Astonishing. We arrived at the new camp on a Friday night. Shabbos fell on the 13th of Adar, February the 28th, and on Motzei Shabbos, the holiday of Purim, began. I gathered 15 Jews and began telling them Megillas Esther, a story about Achashverosh, Haman, and the miraculous salvation of the Jewish people. One prisoner, Isaac Mironovich, lost his temper. He was not young, he was serving a 10-year term. He almost flew at me with punches. Who needs your meisters about what happened 2,500 years ago? Tell me, where is your God today? Do you know what will soon happen to the Jews of the USSR? Is it not enough that the Germans finished off 6 million? Here they are about to be done with another 3. I said in response, says Rabbi Silva, true, our situation is difficult, but don't be in a hurry to eulogize us. Haman also sent orders for our destruction to 127 provinces. God will yet help. How will he help? Stalin already planned everything. This is not some Haman from long ago. Then he launched into a speech about how powerful Stalin was. He killed 3 million people, nevertheless achieved collectivization of land, turning all Russians men into slaves. In 1937, he finished off with 8.5 million and more of his own men. He won the war against Hitler after he was deported to the Crimea, etc., etc. Rabbi Silva just carried on. True, he has always come out the winner. But that won't be the case with us Jews. Why not? Like we read in the Haftarah of Parshas Zohar, Netzach Yisrael lo yeshakeh. And Rabbi Silva quotes a pasuk in Tehillim that Hinei lo yonim v'lo yishon shemei Yisrael. After all, Stalin is no more than a human being, flesh and blood, a mere mortal. This fellow said, but Stalin is as strong as steel, despite his 73 years. No, and this is what Rabbi Silva said, no one can tell what will be with Boss of Edom in half an hour, I answered. Isaac Mironovich stomped off in anger. That was on Purim night. In the morning, he came looking for me. Yitzchak, he said, do you know what you said yesterday? What did I say? What do you mean, what did you say? You said at 7:50, 10 to 8 p.m., that Stalin is no more than flesh and blood, and no one knows what can happen to Boss of Edom in half an hour. Today, someone whispered to me that he heard on a German radio that last night at 8:23 p.m., Stalin suffered a stroke and lost his speech. It happened half an hour after you spoke. We laughed at the coincidence. You know what he did after that? He carries on and says, he got out of Tehillim, and he knew that Stalin, who had the blood of tens of millions of people and many, many Jews amongst them on his hands, he said to Tehillim, He said, as soon as I found out that Stalin was not well, I started to say Tehillim so that his end would come sooner. If today I know all of Tehillim by heart, and can start saying any psalm from any point, this is because of Stalin. I went through them repeatedly for 3 days in a row, day and night. While running to get the water, clearing the ground, sitting on the barracks, I stopped only when I found out he was dead. On the 5th of March, they officially announced the news of Stalin's death, his etc., etc. An astonishing insight. So who knows how HaKadosh Baruch Hu works? We can't second guess Hashgacha. But what a remarkable insight that a victim of Stalin's cruel repression that has that interchange in a Russian labor camp. 3 days later, Stalin is dead. Who knows? Who knows? But what we see from all of this, and I'll tell you something else. Look at this. This is from Paul Johnston's famous History of the Jews, page 527. I'll read it to you. Soviet foreign policy decision makers, pragmatism took precedence over ideology. Without changing its official anti-Zionist stance, from late 1944 until 1948 and even later, Joseph Stalin adopted a pro-Zionist foreign policy, apparently believing that the new country would be a socialist and would accelerate the decline of British influence in the Middle East. Have you ever thought about it? It's astonishing that how come that in the United Nations, the famous vote, Russia didn't veto it? Because Stalin thought that this new country would be socialist and would ultimately help accelerate the decline of British influence in the Middle East. Astonishingly, the very Rishaim, the wicked enemies of the Jewish people, ultimately are used by Kodesh Baruch Hu as a vehicle to sort of let the whole story flow out. Astonishing thing. Again, said Rabbi Gladstein, the Mir Yeshiva should have a similar plaque, that this famous yeshiva, the Mir Yeshiva, was built by one of the great supporters of the Jewish people, Joseph Stalin. What you see from here, from this whole story, is how HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world. What you see in the final psukim of the Megillah is a very, very fitting postscript to that. The penultimate pasuk of the Megillah says that Kol Gedulas Mordechai Shegidlo HaMelech Halohem Ksuv Mal Sefer Divrei Hayomim Malchei Mordechai Paras. Megillah says it's not a history book. If you want history, go to the Divrei Hayomim and Malchei Paras and Mordechai Paras. But if you want Yiras Shamayim and Pirsumei Nisa and Hashgacha Protis to see how HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world, that's what Megillah Esther is really about. And you see that's really the theme of Purim. You see that a Purim that's Kol Mokum Shneim Lemelech Stam is Meshamash Kodesh V'Chol. That is referring to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, sometimes HaKadosh Baruch Hu, sometimes Achashverosh. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not mentioned in the Megillah, but he's so much behind the scenes. He's puppeteering from above. And that's Pshat. Says Rabbi Biderman, beautiful, that the Megillah can be read on days 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, which add up to 65. That's the Shem Adnus, which represents Hashem relating to us through nature, but not through overt miracles. That's Yud Kei Vav Kei. So really Purim is about HaKadosh Baruch Hu running the show, puppeteering from on high. And you see that throughout the story, that Haman is preparing ultimately for his own downfall and is just a puppet in the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A remarkable thing, and you see it with, like the Stipler says, with Moshe Rabbeinu and Pharaoh. All of his decrees ultimately lead to his own downfall. And that's true with the Bayis Sheni as well. We've come full circle. The Megillah starts with celebrating Bayis Sheni not being rebuilt, and then all of a sudden that party was the downfall of Vashti, which led to the appointing of Esther, and then Daryavish, and ultimately that Suda was the first parlor meeting for Bayis Sheni. And Torah in America, it was none other than King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella who, the day after expelling the Jews on the 2nd of August 1492, on the 3rd of August 1492, they fund the trip for Christopher Columbus to set sail to America, which ultimately gave haven for Torah in America today. And Stalin and the Jews creating playing a part in the existence of Torah in Eretz Yisrael today. We can get tremendous comfort from this. We're living in difficult times, and it's only a fool can guess how Hashgacha is going to unfold. But we have to be alert to the fact that Purim teaches us that Hinei lo yonam v'lo yoshen she'im Yisrael, HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world, and he's puppeteering to get to this glorious day where we'll see Hashem Echad Shema Echad. We should all have a Mitzvah Hashem Besuras Tovas for us and for the whole of Klal Yisrael. We should have really Besuras Tovas, particularly in Eretz Yisrael, and everyone should have a Freilich and Purim.